Hello everybody, I'm Rich Holder, and as always, welcome to the channel. While you're here, please make sure like, share, subscribe, go to all those corners, do all those things so you get notified when I do all this testing. Welcome to the part 3 and the final installment of our hunt for grunt. In part 1, we took a look at a 461 build-up where we designed the motor basically for enhanced torque production. Put together a mild combination that I could use in my crew cab dually, and then we ran it with two different superchargers. We ran it with a small 174 blower and then with a bigger 420 mega blower. In part 2, we stepped things up to a 496-inch build. We went up in displacement, we went up in camshaft, and we went up in cylinder head flow, and naturally also went up in power, but we also ran that combination with a 420 mega blower. The question is now, how do those two things compare? In this third and final installment, we're going to take a look at a comparison between the two naturally aspirated combinations, 461 versus 496. Then we're going to take a look at our 461 combination with a small 174 blower compared to the naturally aspirated 496. Then we're going to take a look at both motors, the big motor and the small motor, both run with the same blower and the same pulley ratio. What happens to boost and what happens to power? And finally, we're going to finish off by running both of our combinations, same blower, same boost. What happens to power? Lots of stuff. So let's check it out. Okay, guys, here we go into part 3 of my hunt for grunt, where we're trying to take a big block Chevy and try to maximize torque production because we were using in a towing application, in this case on a crew cab dually I used to tow my race trailer with. So my first big block build was a 454, turned out to be a 461-inch motor, although I did say it was a 468. It wasn't bored that far. But what we did was I chose a bunch of components basically to enhance low speed power. I didn't care really how much horsepower it made. All we wanted was torque down low in the range that we're going to use to tow vehicles. So to that end, 461, I increased the static compression from the stock 77 454 that we took out of this motor. We put the dome pistons in it, small dome pistons, to raise the static compression. We had ported 049 oval port heads that also had a we increased the valve size on it. Joe from Competition Heads did those. Put a very small camshaft in it. 203, 212. I'll go ahead and put the specs up here. And then a dual plane Performer 2.0 intake manifold and a small HOLLEY carburetor. We ran long tube headers on it. And that's the motor that actually went in the vehicle that we drove around in. And it worked fairly well. It made 437 horsepower. The torque, which is the important thing, 542 foot-pounds, but over 500 foot-pounds for basically all of the kind of usable rev range, which is what we were looking for. So that did very well. I'll go ahead and mark these so it'll be easy for you to tell the 496 versus the 454. I know both the horsepowers are blue and both the torques are red, but it's easy to distinguish the two because there's such a dramatic difference. But I'll go ahead and label each one of them. And on our 489 or our 496, what I did was I took the 454, we stepped up the displacement of it. We put a scat forged rotating assembly on it. We put a forged scat crank, a 4250 stroker crank. We put forged scat rods, and then we put flat top pistons in it, which is an interesting thing because we lowered the compression on the 489 versus the 461. So lower compression, much bigger camshaft in the added displacement allowed us to put more camshaft in it. I'll go ahead and put the specs up on here, but 236 cam versus a 203 cam, big step up in camshaft. Also cylinder heads, we put a set of Canfield as cast aluminum heads on it. Aluminum heads are a good idea, especially since we were running blowers on these, although the iron heads worked fairly well with the blower. We use an RPM air gap, and we also, if you take a look at part 2 of this, I did a carb spacer test where we did an open spacer, 1-inch open spacer carb spacer on the dual plane intake manifold, and it did what we expected to do. It picked up power at the top and lost a little bit of power down low. We ran a HOLLEY carburetor on there, long tube headers. Both of them had MST distributors, but you can see the upgrades that we made to the bigger motor on the 496, not only did the added displacement, but the bigger cam and head flow and stuff really paid big dividends. It made a lot more power. Compared to the 461, we made 400, and we went from 436 horsepower, 437 horsepower to 566 horsepower. So we picked up a lot of power. Peak torque was up also from 542 to 581. So not as big a jump in torque. And especially if we look down here in the 3,500 range, we're looking at a difference of 542 foot-pounds versus 571 foot-pounds. So only about 30 foot-pounds of torque gain in that low RPM range. And so let me know in the comments, what do you guys think? Is that because we lowered the compression? Is that because we put the big camshaft in it? Is that because the Canfield heads don't make as much low-speed power as the 049 heads? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I think it's probably a combination of all those. But now let's take a look and see what happens when we run our smaller 461. We run it with a blower, and we can compare that to our NA stroker. Okay, obviously a comparison between a mild 461 buildup and a wilder 496 buildup, not really a fair comparison, and it's not. I was just showing you two combinations that we put together, and for the same reason, we stepped our game up to the 496. But before we did that, we also ran superchargers on both of these combinations. So what I want to do now is we're going to compare the smaller, milder motor, but with a supercharger, to the NA stroker motor. So here is our NA 454 or 461, the 437 horse, 542 foot-pounds. But here's what happened when we added a small 174 supercharger to this combination, running 5.3 pounds, produced 580 horsepower. Torque was up nice, 634 foot-pounds of torque. So the question is, how does that compare to our NA 496? So if you're comparing, smaller motor with boost to just a bigger motor with better cylinder heads and camshaft and intake manifold. So here's our comparison. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our starting point, the NA 461, but I'm going to go ahead and label these. Obviously the blues are horsepower, the reds are torque. I'll label them. The supercharged 454 461 made more power than the NA 496. Not terribly surprising. I mean, excuse me, we're only running a little over 5 pounds, but still, we have 580 horsepower basically versus 566 horsepower. And in terms of torque, the supercharged 461 produced 634 foot-pounds, and the NA 496, 581 foot-pounds. I don't look at this so much as a direct comparison, but I was happy when we put together the 496 that we could get this thing, especially with low compression, to make almost as much power as the smaller, milder motor did with the blower. So we were already starting out pretty good. And honestly, had we started this thing out at 9.5 or 10 to 1 like I normally do with these 496s, the 496 would have easily exceeded the power output of the supercharged 461. But the other thing that we did is run 420 mega blowers on both of these. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you what happens when we run the blower with the same pulley on both of these combinations, what happens to power and what happens to boost. And then also I'm going to show you what happens when we run these two combinations with the same boost. Okay, now let's check out and see what happens when we ran the bigger 420 mega blower on both our 461 and our 496. This is our 461, so our mild combination, but with the mega blower and two 750 blower carburetors. We ran, the pulley combination was a 56-tooth blower pulley and a smaller 52-tooth crank pulley. This thing produced a peak of 6.4 psi at 5,600 RPM. And to give you an idea, this was the gain offered by the bigger blower compared to the smaller blower. So we went from 580 horsepower to 643 horsepower. We went from 634 foot-pounds up to 686 foot-pounds. That was just by upgrading the blower, going from the small 174 to the 420 on the 461. Now let's see what happens when we ran this same blower with this same pulley combination on our wilder 496. So we can see, not surprisingly, the NA 496 made more power. NA, quite a bit more power. And with the same size pulley, it also made more power with the supercharger. So the power jumped up from 643 horsepower to 759 horsepower. Peak torque was up not quite as much, from 686 foot-pounds to 712 foot-pounds. And you can see, just like when we were looking at the NA curves, most of the gains are, in the higher RPM range. Down low, they were fairly comparable. But one thing we're seeing here is the thing that's limiting the amount of power gain that we're getting from this combination by running them with the same pulley ratio. Because what happened is the boost dropped down from 6.4 pounds with the smaller motor down to just 4.9 pounds with the bigger motor. So as we always see when we have increased efficiency or size of the motor, we run the blower at the same speed, the boost will come down and the power will come up. And that's exactly what happened here. But the thing that's limiting the gains that we see here is now actually the speed of the blower. Because the blower now is the limiting factor. By spinning the blower a certain speed and running it at this pressure, it's only going to flow a certain amount of air. And that's what kind of is what's dictating this now. We know the blower will support more power. We know the engine will make more power. And we'll see that when we step up and pulley. So now let's step up and pulley and find out what happens when we compare them basically at the same boost level. If they're both running the same boost from the same blower, now how much power do they make? Okay, now let's take a look at our final comparison where we equalize the boost for both combinations, both the 461 and the 496, and we did that by changing the pulley ratio on the 496. Now, it should be noted that we cannot duplicate exactly the same boost curve for both these combinations. They both share the same blower, but the combinations are wildly different. So what I had to do basically is pick some arbitrary RPM where the boost was equal. In this case, we picked 5,500 RPM, where the boost for both combinations was exactly 6.2 psi. Elsewhere in the curve, it might be a little bit different, but let's take a look and see what happened. This was our combination, producing 643 horsepower and 686 foot-pounds of torque. This was our 461 combination with our 420 mega blower, and it had a 56-tooth blower pulley and a 52-tooth crank pulley. It made a peak of 6.4 psi, but at 5,500 was 6.2. Now let's take a look at our 496 combination. This, like I said, 6.2 psi at 5,600 RPM. We actually revved this one out a little bit further. In fact, all the way out to 6,100 RPM. The power curve was still climbing, where this thing produced a peak of 798 horsepower and 745 foot-pounds of torque. So you can see the difference between these two. Not surprisingly, it kind of mimics what's happening when we ran these both these motors naturally aspirated. The power combinations or the power production for each one closer down low, just like they were in NA, and then they spread apart as we go up in RPM. The NA combination, the 496, more camshaft, better cylinder head, more displacement. It basically wants more airflow, and it wants to make more power, and that's exactly what it did. All right, shareholder, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I'll keep testing, and please, it's very important, if you want to make a good blower motor, make a really good NA motor.